Schönen guten Abend, herzlichen Dank für Ihre Geduld. Thanks a lot for your patience. I'll switch to English as we have a great international guest tonight. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Architekturzentrum Wien, the Austrian Architecture Museum. I'm looking forward to a very special evening tonight because we have a very special guest, Raquel Rolnik, professor and housing activist from Sao Paulo. I'm sure even though we had to switch to a digital presence, her talk will be no less inspiring tonight. Raquel, thanks a lot to you for accepting this invitation. Here with us in the lecture hall of the AZW are Gabor Heinl, professor in Kassel and architect in Vienna, who will act as respondent tonight, and Elke Krasny, professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and co-curator of the Yasmin Lowry exhibition next door. She will moderate the evening. Many thanks to both of you. Housing under the dictate of finance, a human rights crisis, is the title of this event. Housing has become one of the key assets for the international finance sector, which is posing a massive global threat to the right to housing. And yes, even in Vienna, where we can look back on a unique history of social housing, many parameters have changed since the financial and economic crisis in 2008. This is one of the reasons why we are starting a new series together with the city of Vienna. The series Wohnimpulse, Impulses for Housing, will be dedicated to an intensive exchange between international and Viennese positions in housing. So the second one is scheduled for, I think, November, if that's right, or October, for November. So we will have two architectural positions then. So today it's a mixture between theory and architecture. In this way, this new series follows on from a long-standing cooperation with the IBA Vienna New Social Housing. The IBA has ended, as you all know, in the meantime, but fortunately the actors remain with us. Therefore, I would like to welcome Kurt Hofstetter, now Head of Unit Strategic Projects and International Affairs of the City of Vienna, MR50. Sounds strange, MR50. And I would also like to thank his colleague, Amila Zirbegovic, and of course, Lene Benz for the AZW for their work for this new series. Thanks a lot to all of you. Enjoy the evening and have an inspiring evening.
Thank you, Angelika. In the last few years, we have been able to create a space with a series of events. You talked about it, called IBA Meets Architects, and this was done in this room and in close and very fruitful cooperation with AZW, so I'm very thankful to Angelika and AZW. And this series has opened the door to an impulse of outside, to ideas and showcase projects from other cities and other countries. In a time of focusing on the achievements of social housing in Vienna, our intention was to resist the temptation of resting on our laurels, on just using the low fruits, if you would say so. We wanted to encourage discourse and exchange and invite a fresh perspective from outside. So I'm very delighted that we have found a format again that will allow us to continue this path after the conclusion of IBA, and we are therefore opening the Wohnimpulse with the burning topic. You see it here. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights defines housing among numerous other aspects as part of a standard of living to which everyone is entitled. In the same sentence, there is also the right of food, the right to clothing, the necessary social benefits, to security in case of unemployment, of illness, or loss of means of subsistence due to circumstances beyond one's control, and so on. However, many highly industrialized and above all highly technology societies are increasingly moving away from these goals, sometimes in giant steps, and are allowing more and more people to slip into living conditions that they can no longer provide them with these securities. In Vienna too, the category rent alone has been increased 4 times within the last 15 months by a total of about 24%. So the wage agreements were about 7 to 9%. And the same forces that are not willing to put a stop to this development, even though they would be in the position to do so, are already urging so-called wage restraint in the next negotiations. What they probably mean is the income gap is to be widened even further, while the redistribution of public funds into private hands should not be disturbed. The high proportion of subsidized rental housing and municipal housing in Vienna helps to soften the serious effects of these developments, at least for a considerable proportion of the population. This is mainly done through long-term contracts, but also indirectly through the price dampening effect of the non- and limited profit housing associations on the private housing market. Nevertheless, for around 14% of the Austrian population, the monthly household income is below the official at risk of poverty threshold, which is about 1,300 euros per adult. According to a study by WIFO, even the bottom 30% of income are currently unable to cover their expenses in full from their income, but have to resort to savings or other sources. We therefore need to find ways of providing a positive outlook for these circumstances, and above all for the people affected. So I'm very pleased that we can talk to Raquel Rolnik about this today, and Angelika will introduce her, I guess, or Elke Krasny will introduce her more in detail. Last October, we had the honor to welcome Raquel together with Sandy Hilal and David Madden to the launch of the Research Center New Social Housing at the Vienna University of Technology, and we are now looking forward to an inspiring and flaming exchange. Thank you so much.
Also a warm welcome from my side. I'm deeply honored to be moderating an evening with 2 people whose work I deeply admire. Raquel Rolnik and Gabo Heindl are both architects, urbanists, educators, and activists, and their work makes a difference in the real world. So I think it's really, really fantastic that the 2 of them find themselves, even though not in the same space, at the same time, mediated by technology that brings us together, so that Gabo is in the space with us physically, and Raquel is with us via Zoom. First, we will have a lecture by Raquel Rolnik, and then there will be a response by Gabo. And afterwards, there is time for a conversation between the 2 of them and a conversation with the audience. I will now share Raquel Rolnik's bio with you, and then before Gabo will responding, I will share her bio with the audience. Raquel Rolnik is a professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of Sao Paulo. She's an architect and urban planner with over 35 years of scholarship, activism, and practical experience in planning, urban land policy, and housing issues. In her career, she has held various government positions, including Director of the Planning Department of the City of Sao Paulo, 1989 to 1992, National Secretary for Urban Programs of the Brazilian Ministry of Cities between 2003 to 2007, as well as NGO activities such as Urban Policy Coordinator of the Polis Institute between 1997 and 2002. In May 2008, Raquel Rolnik was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing for a 6-year mandate, which ended in June 2014. She's the author of several books, and Gabo has her book in her hand, the one that we use in teaching all the time. It's titled Urban Warfare, Housing Under the Empire of Finance, and I'm very much looking forward to Raquel Rolnik's lecture.
Anderes besser. Raquel? Raquel, do you hear? Hello? Raquel, it would be your turn now. You could start with the lecture. Now she disappeared. Yes, the stage is yours.
Hi, how are you?
We are fine, actually. You could start with your lecture if you like.
Oh, good. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity, which I wish I was there in person, relating to you and be able to discuss with you. But I am absolutely sure that this opportunity will come. So let's at least use this space to open up a discussion. So in order to bring the things that I want to bring to you today, I would start by thinking on this very strange landscape, which, despite affirming uniqueness and singularities in their spectacular forms, in reality, they repeat themselves over and over again across the globe. I'm talking about corporate towers, the tallest buildings in the world, shopping malls, international hotels. They are what I could call rent-seeking landscapes, products for the real estate financial complex, vehicles for future rent extraction in space and time, cumulative and speculative markets. These colonization take over our cities in order to offer in a trade those products that are able to attract an electronic cloud of financial fluxes which floats over the planet looking where to park in order to receive interest, income, and revenues. And we are talking about a surplus capital which is accumulated in financial circuits, which is absolutely able to park everywhere in the globe in their hunger for a good asset. So I'm talking about the financialization of built space, of the built space. a new colonial power, which is deterritorialized, abstract, fictitious, and speculative by nature, and which is made by an electronic digital global platform, which is capable of concentrated in the virtual space what is dispersed in material space, able to make circulate what once built space. The architecture, one of the most iconic arts, once was fixed in space, but the possibility of entry and exiting built space as a vehicle for capital accumulation made those values, those representations of built space to circulate in under an unprecedented scale, enhanced by a mass of surplus capital available in the planet and ready to circulate. So I'm talking about sovereign funds of countries. I'm talking about the mass of capital which is in the hands of plutocrats. I'm talking about the mass of financial capital related to corporations, like big corporations like Apple, Google, like Amazon. I'm talking about shake oil holders, and with all this money, which is concentrated, is just there and waiting for a possibility of gaining more rentability, to be bigger, to look for where to gain more rentability, to be bigger, over and over. And those fluxes discovered that build space is the best asset for them. And why build space is the best asset for them? And that started some time ago, and I will be back to that. It's the best asset because it longs for a long time. It does not disappear like other investments. Also, the fact that since the build space is a very long cycle, have a very long cycle of life, it can appreciate value, devaluate, appreciate value. So for those type of surplus capital, of massive surplus capital, which has a long-term expectancy of return, it's also the perfect situation because it never disappears from the space. And everybody knows that in our real life, when we ask to a bank manager for a loan, the first question the bank manager will ask is, do you have a property? Do you have an apartment or a house to present as collateral? And that's exactly the type of function build space has for credit and for financial fluxes. So can you imagine for those billions and zillions of dollars circulating, euros and dollars circulating, what type of assets they need, the creation of the assets in order to provide the leverage of their capacity of dealing with more money. So it's exactly what this type of build space is, and it's very important, and I started with that, because this is not necessarily places to live. This is not necessarily places people need in our cities. Part of it, including, can be absolutely empty and still there, being a collateral and a leverage scheme because it's written on the books. But the thing is that more than a form of organizing capital and economy, we are talking about a new biopolitics in its reorganization of bodies, subjectivities, and forms of political, social organization. And I bring here the first real estate financial complex product that relate financial instruments with built space was the shopping mall, and the shopping mall replaces the old shopping street or shopping strip or the old market. And this is not just a difference in the way it's built or in the architecture, but it's a completely difference in the way people experience being in the city, relating in commerce as a part of their daily life, as a part of the culture. So I'm talking about private regimes of territorial control organized under the logic of consumption and accumulation, which changes a lot also the way we organize our lives, with the only goal of generating rent, interest for global and local capital invested, and it's increasingly very difficult to separate them. Yes, we are talking about several processes which are occurring simultaneously. Changes in the political economy of work with the Uberization, changes, and this is very important here to talk, in the role of state and the nature and forms of action of financial capital. In terms of the role of state, we are talking about the dismantling of the welfare paradigm and social demands being tied more and more to financial capital. So what we call the financialization of social rights. I know that this depends a lot, this is dependent on the trajectory of each country, and in the case of Vienna, no, of each city inside the country. But a general paradigm shift, we are seeing a general paradigm shift everywhere. And I will take the case of housing, which is our main topic here, as an example, but not because it's an example of that, but because housing, the building and managing of housing became a very important frontier for this financialization of built space. And we are talking about a paradigm shift from housing as a human right, as a social policy, into housing as a commodity, housing as a financial asset. And yes, it's important, and I will bring a lot of my research on the case of US and the case of UK, and I know that this is different from the case of Vienna and other European cities or countries, but it's important in order to understand the logic. But basically, the main idea, the main new paradigm was organized around home ownership. So we are talking of a change that occurred from early 20th century until the 60s, 70s, or 80s, depending on the specific trajectory of each country, of each case. Something that was very important was state-led, with state subsidies of housing as a part of the social policy, as a part of a social fabric of communities, of community building, it had several different approaches, but I would say with European social democracy and rented housing, publicly rented housing for the majorities was one of the prevalent schemes, massive production of housing projects, all the modernist dream of housing for all, with the idea of not only doing homes for people, but also building new types of communities, in the sense that this was basically an idea of taking out part of the wealth produced by the society in order to redistribute it for all. So it had a very redistributive stance on it, but also a very important sense of universality, of an idea that everybody, not important the ethnic background, the rank, the income, should have access to adequate housing. So this is housing as a human right. But the difference now when the shift started and the epicenters of this change were US under Reagan and UK under Margaret Thatcher, with the main idea of transforming houses into commodities and later to financial assets through promoting the one and only model, which is home ownership, individual freehold property of home as the one and only model. And this led, and I won't develop that, eventually we can discuss that in our discussion, to the mortgage and financial crisis of 2008, or when, and we were talking about processes that dismantled welfare-based housing social policies with massive privatization, with selling out and dismantling and demolitions of housing projects, with the promotion of credit to buy a to homeowners, even for those who had never any conditions to get into credit, and presenting that as the solution to access for housing for all, really shifting the debt or the fiscal burden from the states to the families and for individuals. And the result was that this was a complete mess and a housing emergency in places where this housing emergency didn't exist before. And that was done not only, and this is an image of US federal expenditure on housing for homeowners versus affordable housing assistance. We can, in the US, you see the dismantling of all the subsidies that existed in order for HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development Agencies, local agencies, to be able to build and maintain over time housing projects. And that's why they decayed materially. And this shift of the money from affordable housing to homeowner tax deduction. So here it's very important just to bring that. It is a total lie that promoting the privatization of housing through credit, the state is out of the business. No. Through several mechanisms, state money, sometimes land, sometimes with dollars, is highly subsidizing the real estate taken over of the housing sector everywhere. But in different contexts, and I'm bringing here the case of Santiago, Chile, which also became a very important epicenter of this paradigm shift. All the self-built communities that existed in the center of Santiago were transferred to housing projects in the periphery, which we call, in a more simple way, as housing plantations. Only housing, no city, piles and piles and piles of people. And this scene that we have seen in Chile, we can see in Mexico, we can see in Brazil, we can see in South Africa, we can see in Angola, we can see in many, many cities in the global south, in which the paradigm of home ownership private production of massive private production of new homes, private homes, which were accessed to through credit, were promoted as the best solution for all. And we can see how much this was stressed. And in the case of Europe, it was very clear how much European Union was pushing countries like the Netherlands or like Denmark, which maintain universal policies of housing as a very important part of their social fabric, push them to reform their housing systems, to introduce new mechanisms, and in order to introduce the hegemony of housing as a commodity and not as community building, which was in principle what had fed the utopian housing policy that included inspired Red Vienna. So the question I will address here is, what is the role of right to housing in this process? My approach here is to interrogate hegemonic assumptions on the housing question, which are circulating presently among governments, multilateral agencies, and think tanks, in order to point out the misunderstandings, the perversities, and traps embedded in them. So those assumptions had created a property, real estate interpretation of the right to housing, which is indeed preventing the real possibilities of the right to housing, which is preventing the real possibilities of universalizing access to adequate housing for all, the utopian goal which gave birth not only to social housing, but also to housing as a human right. And to argue these assumptions is essential to renew our vision on social housing as well as on the right to housing. First, the real estate misunderstanding. What is the mantra of the real estate? Is housing crisis is a result of lack of new residential units to be produced. So the solution is to build as much as new residential units as possible. This assumption has informed everywhere policies designed to increase building rights in cities through rezoning, among other instruments, to attract investment capital in real estate, through public-private partnerships, urban renewal projects, including making available public lands to investors without taking into account the nature of contemporary real estate financial context. So since the late 80s, a perverse combination of neoliberalism, globalization, financialization made it possible for investors to move their liquid capital freely across national borders, sectors, projects, and cities, and the capacity of international money to move and assembly has changed dramatically, and the digital revolution has facilitated circulation and movements, turning them into a powerful virtual flux. Rather than real pieces of gold or silver moving from place to place, it takes only a single gesture, a bit, for capital to come and go. And another important change has been massive securitization, or the creation of new financial and planning instruments in order to enable capital to come and go from built space without physically or materially changing the ownership of the place. The built environment in general, and housing in particular, became a new frontier for speculation and rentership. Built space and urban infrastructure have become the preferred forms of collateral for this global mass of financial capital, as I say, and the result has been displacement and a large-scale housing crisis, because Ordinary people with meager incomes and precarious employment have to compete for space with financially powerful corporations, oil sheikhs, pension funds, sovereign funds of states, and other financial players. So even if we build more and more, those rent-seeking landscapes can provide more collateral and leverage finance, but very seldom more homes. The second mantra, the liberal mantra line, to increase access and not distort the market and to control state debt, housing should be provided by the market and state should be kept out of the business. So governments actively promoted the colonization of urban space by finance with the normative power to establish the rules, producing, reproducing, and maintaining the link between finance and built space, but also defining the boundaries of territories and bodies subject to dispossession, as well as using the judicial and repressive system to impose and govern them. Hence, legal apparatus of the state has been one of the protagonists of the transformations, contradictions, and disputes around the territory, in addition to the dismantling of all sorts of regulatory barriers to the planetary circulation of financial assets. Law has had an active role in establishment of the financialized city, as well as defining its margins which are the place that can be destroyed and displaced to open a new frontier for the real estate financial complex. They also allow the quick entry and exit of capital with no heavy and complex transaction funds or notary maneuvers. In other words, architecture has been dematerialized to circulate through technologies and information flows as pure value, or better said, as future expectation of value. And securitization has consolidated the link between the rapidly material and abstract level of finance and the concreteness of built space. Securitization is public policy, is an active creation of states. The disposal of public land for real estate financial companies to make public-private partnerships viable is also an active role and budget spending of the state, in which public patrimony, which in its origin were common goods, are transferred directly and without mediation to the private sphere. Urban renewal operations are also released from the constraints of public sphere. They are not previously inscribed in plans. They are not debated and negotiated in institutions designed for this purpose, such as city councils. And to make the business viable, private contractor relations are negotiated based on business models and not the needs of the city, outside administrative agencies and parliaments, and thus isolated from public accountability and democratic control. This is also state-led action. Instead of stepping out, the state assumed a new role, leading a process of ideological and material destruction of the welfare state and constituting a new expansion frontiers for the market. For example, public housing states are demolished or privatized to give rise to a unique paradigm of homeownership, which are accessed to mortgage credit through large public subsidies. This operation also transfers the financial burdens from states and families, exposing them to the fluctuations of the financial market in a debt-based economy. The 2008 mortgage and financial crisis, which led thousands of indebted families to lose their homes without any public housing policy option available to cope with the situation, was already one of the effects of these transformations. The promise of the 80s that the market would respond to all human needs, that credit was all we need to attain our basic needs and desires, clearly remains unfulfilled. Instead, communities in the world over have witnessed an increase in poverty, concentration of income, widespread indebtedness, and inadequate access to housing. Third, the coloniality threat. Homeownership should be the ultimate goal of the implementation of the right to housing for all, and right to housing is equal right to property. And I think this is very meaningful for the debates we are facing now and will be the last part of my intervention here. At the foundation of the connection between space and finance lies the liberal idea of private property, which has historically modulated the territorial organization of cities and established borders between the city and its margins, marked as outcast and subnormal. Those urban margins, marked as subnormal, are stigmatized, criminalized, racialized places which are under permanent threat and simultaneously functional to the real estate financial capital, performing the role of the preferred territories to be used as new frontiers for capital extension. These places can be deeply marked by violent dispossessions and destructions in the name of legality. But the essential condition for built space to become a financial asset, circulated freely in the global financial market, as we have seen, is the existence of one and only form of legal relationship between the asset owner and the physical space it occupies, registered individual property registered in the notary. This point is important because the paradigm of registered individual property, hegemonic over all other forms of relationships between individuals and territory, has been one of the most powerful motivations for denying the right to exist to other types of territorial ties. Take, for example, the historic possession or ancient and sacred connection to land of indigenous communities that were obliterated by a system of registered property. Such system of registration enables the correspondence between a physical and a material place with a piece of paper containing rational and abstract mathematical coordinates. It decodes physical space and blurs complexity, translating it into a quantifiable and measurable thing necessary for fluxes of capital. This hegemony of property as the only legitimate form of possession is part of a not yet completed process of the past 250 years in the history of humanity's relationship with inhabited territory. The liberal contractualist transition, organizing economies and societies in their links with the territory, emerged from a new concept of property in land based on spatial exclusion and absolute right to individual ownership, which links persona to res via contractual interaction, which gives rise to the basic legal conceptualization of rights and duties. This model is later consolidated in the form of nation states, which provides the conceptual and practical metrics of the notion of public, conceived as separate, albeit intrinsically connected to the private, intentionally exclusive as a sphere in which the legitimate public only includes those who have a place governed by private property rules to call their own. Landed property becomes a prerequisite for effective citizenship, and as such, very important foundation for the violences, for the violences that were practiced against all other forms of tenure between people and the territories in which they live and the residualization of those. As movements emerge from different cities around the world show, the implementation of financialized model of housing planning and urban development does not occur without political and social battles and different forms of resistance. Beyond the capture of territories by finance, there is also a permanent movement of emplacements, generating landscapes for life. Different resistance experienced in cities around the world with the use of insurgent tactics, such as sweating occupation, but also, and I will end showing that and bringing that into our discussions, communal forms of ownership and other and collective and complex bond with land, which indeed performs blockages against the submission of built space to finance. What I'm bringing is the more complex, collective way of appropriating space, the less subject to financialization and commodification the space is. So occupation, as well as other communal forms, and I will talk a little bit about that, they focus on rescuing land use value and taking it out from the asset markets in order to place it under communal management, and they present a clear challenge to hegemonic and exclusionary concept of private property. They promote bonds with land that are much more connected to the practice of possession and use of space, thus creating more complex networks based on belonging. So I bring here just some example of the housing cooperatives, and I'm talking about cooperatives being imagined, being built, managed, and lived collectively, and we have a very long story of tradition of this collective. Examples from Uruguay, examples from the old Yugoslavia, examples from Sweden abound in terms of the type of rights embedded in these cooperatives. Also, in the case of US, it's very important now, community land trust, and this is important in a context like US, where housing is absolutely commodified. And yes, we are talking about important experiences in different parts of US. But I would just stop here by telling you that not by chance I have started this last part of my intervention related to the future by pointing the importance of actually existing emplacements and their resistance tactics. So every policy of maintaining bonds based on use value and not exchange value, every essay and every place that is being built and lived collectively instead of individually as a commodity or a financial asset, they offer us a concrete starting point to reverse our vision of social housing and right to housing threat, as we demonstrated in the exclusionary models and modeled by the real estate financial complex. Here comes the right to housing. But what exactly is it? It's the utopia of integration and inclusion, which intends to reproduce models of urban life that exist in centers where the most well-off segments of society concentrate. Does it mean extending the real estate financial complex to the peripheries of the city, as I showed in the case of Chile, Mexico, to make a toxic urban model available to all? Does it mean the elimination of racialized spaces and submission to destructive logics of capital for all? We have here an opportunity for rupture, including the rupture of our own utopias of territorial inclusion, which requires the submission of all forms of organizing space and ways of life to the one and only destructive, indebted logic of capital markets. Borrowing from Henri Lefebvre notion of the right to housing as an ethos of engagement, the right to housing encompasses the possibility of city residents defining their destinies and owning the city, not in the sense of property, but rather in the sense of belonging. A movement to free us from hegemonic models and make it possible to support the existence and development of diverse urban experience. This new urban vision that can emerge from the global and local articulations and convergence of experimentation, organizations, and actions embedded in urban struggles. Social housing policies must be organized around the fundamental idea that is necessary to break with the protection of rent-seeking landscapes and head in the direction of producing landscapes for life and for care. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for this passionate and powerful lecture that introduced the difference between landscapes for finance and landscapes for life and care. I will now introduce Gabo Heindl, who is tonight's respondent. She's a professor at the Institute of Architecture, Urban Planning, Landscape Planning at the University of Kassel and head of the Department of Architecture, Cities, Economies. Gabo is an architect, urban planner, and activist. Her Vienna-based practice, Gabo Heindl Architektur, focuses on public space, collective housing, and urban justice. Gabo holds a master's in architecture and urbanism from Princeton University and wrote her PhD on radical democracy in architecture and urban planning at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. She was visiting professor at Sheffield University and diploma unit master at the AA in London. Gabo shares her knowledge from her many years as independently practicing architect and from her writing and research on strategies for cities, such as the history of utopian Red Vienna and its possible futures, on radical democracy, and on relating political philosophy to activist practices of architecture and urbanism. She is co-editor of Building Critique, Architecture and Its Discontents, and author of the book Stadtkonflikte, Radical Democracy in Architecture and Urban Planning, und gerechte Stadt muss sein. And I'm very much looking forward to Gabo's response to Raquel.
Thank you very much, Elke. I used the moment that you made me show Raquel's book to now also show my own book. Thank you very much for this introduction and for the chance to respond to Raquel Rolnik, who I also deeply admire, and also, of course, Raquel, thank you very much for this energizing talk, and also I wished we could be in the same space, but I also appreciate very much that somebody is saying, okay, I'm not going to fly all over the world to be with us when we can actually have a way to be together in the room. I really tried to prepare the response. Of course, we had a talk before what Raquel will be talking about more or less, but it was about responding really to this talk and to, in a way, instantly try to think, how does all of this relate to Vienna? Or how does it actually relate to our condition of housing? And of course, if Raquel started with Dubai, with the global south, with lots of places that seem so far away from us, I think It will take us some time, but I try to relate this financialization process also that it's kind of also in the middle next to us where we are actually living. Also, I think this is important because I'm sure you're aware of the fact that the New York Times just praised Vienna, Red Vienna, as the renters' utopia. The Guardian just praised Vienna as the dream of all housing seekers. I think all of these texts are really valuable to show the world that another alternative like the Viennese housing model is possible. But then again, it also seems to portray a model of a city that is just perfect, where we know that it's also not. And maybe this is... Okay. Do you hear me a bit, Raquel? Not at all, okay. Maybe you can, you know what you could do? You could actually get this online and also link it to the, because that's what I was, oh, I took this, I take this one. I sit there, that's very good. Sitting over. Maybe you can hear me now better. Okay. Raquel, do you hear me now? Okay, yes, okay. And is that not too loud for you guys? No? Okay, super, okay. When Raquel spoke about cities being a good asset, then we would have to ask ourselves to what extent Vienna is a good asset. And honestly, if we think about, and I just made some thinking about where, in what instances is actually Vienna a good asset, then we have to speak about BUWOG, like basically we're talking with, I'm starting with Bund, yeah? Basically BUWOG being privatized as a measure of the Bundesregierung, not Vienna, BUWOG now being part of Vonovia, Vonovia being linked with Deutsche Wohnen, Deutsche Wohnen being linked with Blackstone that Raquel speaks a lot about, and all of these big corporations are actually very eager to invest even in Vienna's social housing. And I've seen myself, BUWOG and Vonovia asking kind of kindly in Vienna if they couldn't also themselves get a nice little piece of kind of housing plot for subsidized housing and invest exactly there where they have started to actually privatize in big scale housing units from the Austrian housing market. If we think about, honestly, Erste Bank, now going to Czech Republic and to Yugoslavia, to ex-Yugoslavian countries, and selling a so-called Viennese model as actually the one model that has been the breaking of the Viennese model, namely the Wohnbauinitiative. You have to imagine, basically, Erste Bank sells the Viennese model in these countries who kind of are interested in and not only Erste Bank, other banks also, basically sells the only model that has started the decay and the erasure of actually what social housing and subsidized housing in terms of security means in Vienna, which is this one Wohnbauinitiative that actually started to also in Vienna, that subsidized housing is not insured for life, but actually will be left out or will be taken out of this insurance after the time that is being paid off. We have to think about public-private partnerships such as Triple, where basically rent prices are enormously high, and now we could say, okay, these projects make no difference, they make an enormous difference in actually raising the idea and the rent level, and also are, of course, exactly these projects that we've just seen on the video in the global housing speculation market. We have to think about, and this is an important aspect that I really want to take out into the world. I'm so very happy that the Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky apartment has become a little museum and a center. But if we know that actually she moved into a Genossenschaft, and this Genossenschaft was sold, and now we are paying Teuner for the rent for this place, Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky would revolt in her grave. She actually moved into a Genossenschaft, and now this apartment is owned by a private investor who we know all too well in this city. If we think of Otto Wagner's Postsparkasse, and I don't know exactly the legal conditions, but I imagine that Angewandte is now renting back from those who bought this house in the first place. It's unbelievable. Basically, the state, it's publicly owned places, and such even architectural jewels are being sold in order to, after that, being rented back by public universities. We have Leinerkicker, I don't even need to say that, we just saw like Benko basically doing exactly that, buying the whole chain for its asset, and now basically just kind of keeping the asset and so on. We have 1,500 apartments per year in Vienna being lost due to the right to buy, which now we are coming back to a Bundesregierungs, to a federal state legislation. You have to imagine that 40 years after Margaret Thatcher introduced right to buy in England, and London and all the cities in England are extremely suffering from that, from the privatization of housing. Our federal state government has nothing else to do than basically make sure that social housing, subsidized housing can not only be bought after 10 years, but now even after 5 years. All of that is basically key, is aspects of this financialization of not even urban space only, but really housing. But then there's also resistance to it, and maybe this is where I would like to change the gear and also go along with Raquel, where you ended with, to say, okay, well, there is all of these logics, and you call it regime of financialization, also trying maybe less in Vienna. Maybe it's less successful or less powerful because Vienna has, after all, this celebrated system, and a very strong 50% of the Viennese, as you know, more or less, are living in communal or subsidized housing. So there is a large idea of collective ownership when it comes to housing. But then again, neoliberalism or capitalism is, of course, and as you called it, this kind of hovering capital, the finance basically structure, capital is interested in investing in Vienna because Vienna is an interesting market, it's a conservative market. And that makes, in terms of crisis, actually makes it even more interesting in investing. And what I find, however, as a reaction remarkable is, for instance, the zoning category. I don't know if, I guess everybody maybe in the room knows that, but because there has such a land-grabbing tendency also in Vienna, actually there's no piece of land in Europe, in Vienna, anywhere that is well accessible, that is at this moment not of interest to being bought. And that is not only urban, that's not only for housing, but it will also be in the future literally for solar panels, for energy production, and also that will be a big discussion, who will own the land, or who will actually own the rights to take the sun energy and turn it into power, into energy. But coming back to housing, so this is what we are also doing at my new chair at the University of Kassel, to really look at the questions of, or like now we all know commodification has been taking place and is constantly taking place. So what we're trying to see is ways and structures of decommodification. How can we actually return the process, which will be very difficult because so much is privatized, of course, in Germany, in the German cities, much more than in Vienna. We are looking at vacancy. Why? Because vacancy is like one big issue that not only global capital is interested in, but that we should also be interested in, whoever is believing in social and ecological issues to come together. If we need more housing, maybe we don't need more newly built housing, but could actually really make sure that we use housing units that are already there but are not being used. By the way, this is something that Red Vienna was heavily drawing on. In Red Vienna, so Red Vienna had inherited a law which it actually activized, which is the so-called Wohnungsanforderungsgesetz or Wohnungsforderungsgesetz, which is not Wohnungsförderungsgesetz, which basically as Wohnungsforderungsgesetz, the right to acquire, to actually demand those housing units then that were empty or that were second, third, fourth apartments not used, to be able to actually demand them from those not using and bring them to usage by renting it out. Something that Barcelona is at the moment doing, something that Portugal, I think, is starting to do. So there's a lot of possible commodification energies. Of course, Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen, expropriates Deutsche Wohnen in Berlin, is an enormously powerful movement which has really made a difference, and even, I would say, a paradigm change, that we can now think, because nearly 60% of all the Berlin voters that were voting in this referendum actually said yes to the idea to re-socialize, to expropriate housing by these big corporations which own more than 3,000 housing units, certainly not for their own interest or their own need, to actually bring it back into collective ownership. And that is really what, Raquel, you were talking about. How can we find back collective ownership models rather than having property as the only relationship between people and land? And that's, I think, what Raquel does so beautifully in her book. She shows all over the world how to own, and now we have to be careful because owning and property is two different words, but let's say to have a property title on an apartment, a house, a one-family house, a block, has become so much like the dream of people rather than actually another sort of ownership, which we could say, or you called it belonging. If we bring back the trust in renting, for instance, renting is to some extent owning in terms of like you own a key to an apartment, and if this key is actually giving you the right unlimited, that means not after 3 years you have to give it back and because of Befristungen, but actually the classical old system of saying, okay, there's rental protection in terms of rent is not befristed, it's not restricted in time, it will be not heightened all the time, yeah? But it's actually, we have a certain rent cap, we have a certain logic that rent actually doesn't need to grow all the time. Actually, rents don't need to rise at all because actually buildings get paid off. But also this logic of really ownership, that you have a belonging to a place, you believe you're safe in a place even though you do not have the property title. And that's something which I wanted to at the end maybe talk about in terms of my architectural practice. We are at this moment, or actually the moment is very well said, since a couple of years working on a project which takes longer, which I have no problem with because good projects take some time, which is SCHLOR. It's an abbreviation for Schöner Leben ohne Reihweisen oder Schöner Leben ohne Rendite, Schöner Leben ohne Räumungen. A group of people that literally bought, in terms of as a capitalist act, a piece of land and with houses, workshops, a circus center, a kind of training hall in the 11th district, and is actually currently, we are as architects supporting them to turn that into housing and living and a circus center. And what is beautiful, they are with their project, with other projects in Vienna, setting up a system which is called Habitat. And Habitat is the sister of a much larger structure in Germany called Mietshäuser-Syndikat. And this Mietshäuser-Syndikat is a syndicate structure which does somehow something that you, Raquel, was mentioning in terms of how do we start this decommodification project, which means if so much is commodified, if so much is privatized, is sold, how do we bring it back into collective ownership, into gemeinschaftliches Gemeinschaftseigentum. So they're actually buying projects out of the capital market, but within this syndicate structure are ensuring, and I think it's something that you said beautifully, they're ensuring a most complex relationship to land in terms of that nobody comes in with their own money. That's the Schöner Leben ohne Reihweisen aspect. They're actually financed by direct support credits by their friend and also by a fund. So they literally kind of managed to get all the money for the construction site without a bank, which is not necessarily, you can also use a bank, but it's like was even their primary goal. The other idea is that nobody needs money to actually be able to find and define and activate a creative project that according to their dreams, ideas, wishes. And also at the end of the day, it's all about using, not owning. Nobody owns there. It's a collective shared ownership between an association, which the group is part of, and they all rent from this association, and the association and the bigger syndicate structure co-own these houses, which actually has such a, how should we call that? It has such a structure that it can never be sold again and not speculated with again. And all the money, the extra profit that is coming in after the building has been paid off is being returned into new projects. And the last aspect, it's also beautiful because these projects take place in built space. They actually reactivate spaces that have been already there and bringing them back to use. So it's also not something in the green space, so to say. Similar project, intersectional city house, we could talk about. I don't think this is the moment to do that. But to kind of bring it back, I think we have in Austria and Vienna a very strong base of Genossenschaften, of basically what is called subsidized housing at this moment, and also Gemeindebauwohnungen. But we must talk about how a lot of people are actually disenfranchised by something that we would and must call actually a collective ownership, which would cater for many more than this 50%, because we know that so many people are actually not only on waiting lists, but are currently enormously exploited by the private markets and or generally by the rise of rents. And I do hope that I did with my response bring some of your issues, Raquel, also into the Viennese context and Central European context, and I would like to be very happy to discuss if we manage to, but also discuss with the audience. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. This is the central and most important mic.
Yeah, I have another one, but maybe we can do it like this. So in order for all of us to hear each other, we will try to share the microphone here. And after Gabu bringing global financialization and situatedness together, explaining that it's also always localized and has very local effects everywhere around the globe and on the planet, I think I would like to begin the discussion not with human rights, which were part of the title, but with the question of land that was very central in what both of you were saying. And I think in a way the discussions of recent years have not only foregrounded the rights of humans, but also the rights of nature, with rivers and mountains and other entities now being given environmental personhood. And I'm wondering how this new relationship to land, beyond ontologies of property, could be related to the rights of nature joining the rights of human in relation to what we call anti-financialization struggles. And I would like to kind of give this question to both of you. Raquel far away and Gabu sitting next to me.
Raquel, the word is yours.
Thank you very much for bringing that. I was thinking that it should be very important to talk about, because when we talk about the idea of the one and only model of relationship between humans and territory being this abstract notion of property, we are talking about a extractive logic of relationship with land and nature. Destructive logic of relation with nature, which have inspire the process of urbanization and industrialization. The idea that nature should be subject to the work of humans, and under this conception was the idea of infinite process of production and consumption, which is behind the notion of development and growth. Development being related to growth, which is related to extracting from nature what is needed in order to provide more and more consumption objects, more and more opportunities for generating income and prosperity and money. So now we are facing a crisis, and I like to see this crisis like a combo. A crisis which is, at the same time, it's a crisis of the relationship between humans and the land and nature, but it's a crisis also of the social relation, socio-economic relation that was created in order to enable that. So this is very deep. and thinking here from the point of view where I am, in the periphery of capitalism, and it's easier because we can see the coloniality of this scheme. It's so clear, the colonial way of occupying and expanding in America, in Latin America, in Africa, was so clearly and so absurdly this idea of taking and extracting. But I think that we should go beyond the idea of colonialism in order to think on coloniality, which refers also to this hegemonic form of relating humans to land in the center of capitalism as well. So I think that we are facing a very, very important challenge, a very, very important challenge, because how to overcome a way of establishing this relation, which is so basic and so structural on making cities. So I would say, like as a glimpse to that, the notion of re-earthing the city, I think it's very interesting. Re-earthing in the sense that when we talk about belonging, collective appropriation, part of, I would say, the agenda that we can have with this reappropriation is also to bring back to nature what is nature. So re-earthing in the sense of opening also space for a different process and different parts of nature to be there, and not only humans. I think it's an endeavor that it's possible exactly in operations, and I like it so much the way Gabu had presented it. We bought in order to take out this land from the capital markets and redefine the way it is occupied and organized. And I'm absolutely sure that in this redefinition, also the idea of re-earthing should be a very important part. Not only the type of ties, collective ties, not only the idea of being there forever and the idea to protect the security of tenure is the key issue. Of course, security of tenure is the key issue, not property, not individual property, security of tenure. But the security of tenure of the nature also should be part of this agenda. And I think it's a beautiful, and these types of reappropriation are a beautiful opportunity to create that and to generate that today, now, and not as an agenda to gain the government to the future, but to make it exactly now.
There was nearly an applause. Yeah, I think, I mean, generally, there is not only, I would say, a solidarity contract to our neighbors, but to everybody who actually should not, to nobody who should be forced to live on the street, but or like not have housing. But we also have a solidarity contract with the next generation. And the question of like how do we leave, what do we leave as a place to the next generation, and how much unsealed land, how much land for agriculture, how much land for leisure, how much land for forests, etc. So I think there is, and I'm very happy that finally, or like I think we really reached that point that nobody would doubt that the social and the ecological question is one question. It's one and the same in terms of there is going to be a serious fight and struggle for the rights to distribution of land, of space, and not only when it comes to housing, but also when it comes to questions of public space, of agriculture, I mentioned it before. I think what, like on a pragmatic level, it's quite interesting how, for instance, land lease has become nearly even like, also Erbbaurecht, Baurecht, for instance, as a structure has nearly become like a tiny little resistant way of Genossenschaften, of housing associations in Vienna to resist the idea of rights to buy. So there's actually also, and I would say something like Mietshäuser-Syndikat structure or generally also community land trusts are actually, community land trust is more a US-American structure. I don't think that it needs to be literally imported while we have other measures of actually securing land. But at the end of the day, and this is so interesting also what Deutsche Wohnen and Co. Enteignen are discussing, what if we would actually be able to re-collectivize? The question will then be, who should take care of it or who should own it? And that's one of the most important questions because, of course, I mean, in my teaching in the UK, I had students from so many places, they don't believe at all into the state. I mean, if you have the state basically in Hong Kong or in places literally being so authoritarian and brutal, you know, you don't believe so much in a state as maybe we do again in Vienna, believing in the commune, in the city. So to find actually models of collective ownership and not falling back into friends owning together or families owning together or because at the end of the day we will also have and we will be more and more a migration society. So basically we will have to find a way how to collectively own with all of them who are not here yet because they still come or who don't have the same passport or skin of color, or who are not even born yet. So in this sense, I think there is a lot to do to really define, and I really like the notion of the most complex relationship to land ownership, which makes it impossible for single structures to actually then privatize or make profit out of it. But generally, I think I would like to ask the question why, if we are not at a point where we would have to rethink generally how something that is so limited because we just only have this amount of land can be actually monopolized.
I think there are hundreds of questions that are in the space, but I would like to, at this moment, open the discussion to the audience. And in order for Raquel to hear, I would just ask you to come up and ask your question from the chair where I'm sitting on. And will of course stand up. So I would like to invite you to come here so that we can have in this arrangement a conversation around the very complex issues of social and ecological belonging and what it means to have housing and shelter. So to make it a little easier.
Yeah. That's the democratization by media.
Yeah, thank you very much for
I think it's best you sit down,
Oh, do I
because
sit
then
down?
you speak into the microphone and she can hear.
My name is Martin, hello.
Sorry for that. It's complicated.
It's good, it's great.
It's very comfortable, thank you very much. It's great. No, thank you very much for the, to both of you and for your questions also. And I have maybe a rather specific question. You were so kind to point to ways of dealing with vacancy. So, and to point out that policies against vacancy are being pursued or developed now in Barcelona and in Portugal. And I, having myself had the good luck to experience the squatting environment in the Netherlands pre-2010, I would be very happy if you could almost in a very concrete manner, like a bit give an overview of what you currently know are actions being taken against vacancy, not only in the squatting way, but any kind of forms, vacancy taxation or any other forms that you would be aware of, that would be really helpful. I will go sit back down. Thank you.
As you wish. Maybe before Raquel is answering, I know of a very precise reaction, actually, of Vancouver to its enormous vacancy structures. I mean, in Vancouver is a place where you know from the distance of the center of which you live, basically how little you earn. The more you're further away, that it's because of what you earn, and that nobody can afford the center, and that's why it's completely vacant. And I think a little bit also because there was a relationship of Vienna and Vancouver, and I was also tiny part of it to actually discuss different notions. They introduced a vacancy tax of like 1% of, I don't have the exact kind of calculations of but they just raised it to 3%, realizing that it doesn't, they must make it even much higher. It doesn't hurt anybody yet they actually gained a lot of money from that they can now get put into social housing. Same kind of, a lot of places are trying to, in Germany there's places that are literally installing this, das Gesetz gegen Missbrauch, oder nicht Missbraucher, gegen Falschnutzung, jetzt habe ich es gerade nicht im Kopf, is coming in a moment, but basically cities trying to define that keeping an apartment vacant is actually exactly not what an apartment should do. And the great thing is that we can now argue again double-fold. To have an apartment vacant is the most unsocial thing you can do. It's super egocentric, by the way. You have all the infrastructure run around your nice little vacant place or building or house or a structure. And what is the ecological part and the economical part of it is that's what we are doing at the moment in Kassel. We're calculating for the city of Vienna and the city of Kassel and every citizen how much money it costs to each of us in the city that the place is empty. You can calculate this by the square meter, by the apartment. Just bring out, and there's different calculation models. There's something similar now that the IG Architektur here in Vienna is currently, we're in collaboration looking into. I don't believe too much in fighting economics with economics, but I believe in actually, if nothing helps, then numbers help. And to show that is really powerful, but also to show how much vacant place is there already with regards to the numbers that are being proclaimed. For instance, in Germany, it's said that they need 400,000 new housing units per year. It's absolutely impossible. It would be even insane with this climate catastrophe coming up. So to actually show and calculate how much space is there already sitting empty and how many apartments there are, and to finding calculation models so I think that's all powerful strategies to deal with. And honestly, the Forderungsgesetz I find even more powerful than a tax, because at the end of the day, it would be actually not the rights, but the duty of every government that can see that there is the right to housing is not fulfilled, to make sure that empty apartments are not sitting empty.
Yeah, let me just add from and I will bring here the Brazilian experience, which I think is twofold. In one side is a very important movement on housing movements since the 90s that are constantly squatting empty, vacant buildings and living there. So that was a very important shift, I would say, because yes, Brazilian São Paulo, like in other cities in Brazil, or other big cities in Brazil, the rule of housing for the majorities was self-building in the peripheries, expanding the city in undeveloped areas with no infrastructure and self-building their own homes with scarce resources, which means the production of a very materially precarious city, more and more. But from the 90s on, an organized movement decided not to do that anymore, but to occupy the existing vacant lots and buildings. For instance, only today in São Paulo, we have around 450 occupied buildings in downtown São Paulo. Some of them for many, many years, some of them for more than 2 decades, because it's a constant struggle with movements in the judiciary to go in and out, but also a constant struggle in order to have social policies to refurbish and renovate this building, maintaining the squatters.
Can I add to that?
Including the squatters. So, yeah.
No, I just wanted to add to that because I think thank you for bringing in the squatting, because you pointed out also so beautifully, which I'm fully the same opinion, the right to housing is weaker than the right to property. Yeah, that's what we're discussing here basically. But also the criminalization of squatting is stronger than the criminalization of that you actually with keeping places empty, yeah? And I'm saying this really purposefully, because I do think that squatting actually, and that's why exactly in some other places squatting is not so illegalized as it's here. Basically, to keep a house empty is not only unsocial, but it's even literally the most ecological way of doing. Houses need people. If people are not in houses deteriorate much quicker. So basically, if we want to actually even safeguard the stock of housing, we need people in there, very simply. And to actually say we need to have a discussion about how it comes that the one thing, just to use a place in its social and ecological way, is illegalized, while to have it actually rot away, consciously said, is not. And I think that is something where we really need to engage into a more open-ended, or like really also open discussion about values and about how to the right to actually, and one could say that squatters are scouting. Important, yeah, they're scouting where there is place that could be used.
Yeah, well, and the second line, so one is direct action on squatting, but also relating to the institutional world, trying to get public policies to refurbish it and legalize it, which eventually is done. I would say there is like around 10 buildings that were already refurbished and people are living there. Very few, but still, it's part of this movement. The other side is a legal mechanism that is in place in Brazilian regulatory framework, which is a national framework, the statute of the city, that came from our constitution, new constitution in the democratic era, 1988, saying that any vacant property that is not in use is subject to success living. So the cities must order them to be occupied. They have 2 years to be occupied. If not, they start to pay property tax in an exponential way for 5 years, and then finally they can be expropriated and paid with state debt instead of money. So, I mean, it looks very beautiful in practice. In practice, it didn't really work in terms of being able to provide that, but I think it was a very important part of the discussion and the building of the notion that vacant buildings are outrageous and should not be kept like that.
So I would like to invite the next question to come up here. The next person asking the question.
In a place where question asking is already such a demand, it's challenging, but.
Hello, my name is Thomas Michel. I don't have really a question, but maybe would like to add to your discussion beforehand. I think you meant Leerstandsabgabe, is this correct?
Also Leerstandsabgabe, yes.
I cannot translate it directly into English, but
Which is vacancy tax, maybe.
vacancy
Yeah,
tax.
yes.
But there's something else as well.
Yeah.
You know, at least in Munich, maybe in whole Germany, you have this second apartment tax. So you have, if you have two, in one town, 2 places where you live, 2 flats, then you have to pay for the second one an additional tax, which is 20% of the normal rent, which may quite a lot of money. That could also help, because I fully
absolutely.
support what you said, that a house must be full of people. And you see these problems also not only in these bigger towns, but you see it also in, let me say, holiday areas. There are people who buy houses, they are there maybe for 5 weeks, a year. The rest, these houses are empty. And I think maybe one should, from a socialistic point of view, do something against it. So no question, only a statement.
I think it's a perfect statement and also Ergänzung, addition, because I think what you just brought up, like, could be, let's imagine we had the 3rd apartment or the 4th, and if that would be now taxed exponentially, we are very close to what the Wohnbausteuer of the Red Vienna was.
Yes, good.
And that's exactly what has been basically usually my selling proposition, to say I would love to see, and not necessarily on a new house of the future, but on a newly used house of the future, maybe in the same nice, beautiful red lettering that we see in the Gemeindebauten, errichtet durch die Gemeinde Wien in den Jahren so und so aus den Mitteln der Wohnbausteuer by the means of the housing tax. It would be amazing to say, okay, now we have maybe a vacancy tax, we have CO2 tax, or we have kind of heritage tax, we have wealth tax, and it would be amazing to not only have these taxes, but also maybe proudly put them on refurbished houses that we brought back to use.
Okay, that's one way to solve the problem.
It's one way to draw to draw the image, the picture of it.
I think we can add to this the Airbnb-ification of the world as one deep problem. I mean, I just came back from Athens yesterday, where the neighborhood where I stayed in Koukaki, most people are now moving out of their own apartments in order to rent them, not seeing that this will eventually lead to rents that in the future they themselves will never be able to afford anymore, and are being driven to the peripheries of cities. So I think the ways in which not only the cloud of financialization, but the relation to one's own place as a means of capitalization and commodification, which changes what a home is to a commodity which we inhabit, I think is a very deep, you were saying before, Raquel, it's a deep challenge that we are facing now. And on one hand, we could say it is this deep challenge, but it's also being deepened at the same time by new forms of relating to one's property as property and not as home that we live in. I'm just looking also at the time. So we are at an architecture center here, so that's not why I'm looking at the time. But I wanted, but I wanted to maybe as a last question and food for thought, bring our discussion to the profession. I mean, you're both architects and you're both educators at universities. And so we have already heard from both of you, on one hand, analysis as a means to understand what architects can learn in order to understand the relation between architecture and finance. And particularly from you, Gabu, we have also heard about practical design projects that are being built, and not only built and designed, but organized, where the way in which they are being organized is part of the design process. So I would like to kind of come to this question. Architecture as a profession is profoundly implicated in all of this, and how can we on one hand make architects accountable to what is going on, and what on the other hand, and that's more to you as educators, are the tools that you give future architects to navigate this landscape between finance and life differently?
Yes, that's a very nice question, and I place myself in this place as a professor, but also as an activist, and eventually as a policymaker, because in my life I had different positions in city government, in national government, as official, but also as advisor. So I place myself in the different chairs in this debate, although I don't design. Sorry. But I do see a movement which is very important. A critical movement from the architects, because I started in purpose with these rent-seeking landscapes. These rent-seeking landscapes had a very, very important participation of architects, designing them as spectacular endeavors, and indeed provoking this taking over of our city. So I think that there is an ethic on the profession, which I would say is under challenge, because in one hand, I see more and more, especially young architects, coming and engaging in processes like the one Gabu just described, which is processes of designing with, in a very participatory way, but also in a process which is not only design a building, but also design new ways of organizing life. So, and I can see that in the Global South a lot. People engaging on making self-building communities, but architects being there with technical assistance and working with in order to design popular plans, insurgent planning, abolitionist planning. So at the same time, I see this discussion in the university growing more and more and more. It's not hegemonic at all, at all. I would say it's still minoritarian, but I see this growing. I see this growing, and I think that the more architects are engaged on that, this is also the salvation of the profession, because I think the profession had very difficult times in the last 20 years, from being one of the leading forces of a real utopia of transformation of life, and I'm doing the modernist wave, to be completely subjected to the real estate financial complex in the last decade. So now I think it's coming again, and I'm very proud of being an architect and planner in this moment where this challenge is posed for us on the table. So thank you for bringing this.
I want to say the same. I'm also really happy to be an architect and planner at this moment, even though it's, as you said, I think maybe it's the complete end of the modern project, end of modernity. Like basically, all the concepts and that have been kind of shaping what we do as architects are questioned. And honestly, I'm at this moment very happy because for years I wasn't so sure, but the new generation that at least I'm teaching now is so critical and so political. They despise projects like The Line, for instance, you know, this project Neum in the desert. They would not, at least a lot of them, it's not hegemonic maybe, but there's an enormously growing number of students and young architects who look very carefully, who is engaged in what projects, even though, and that's the tricky part, there is still the question of like how do all the young people who are subjected also to the financialized landscape of housing and need to pay ever higher rents, where do they actually earn money and like be critical? It's super complicated at this moment. Like from my practice, for instance, at the moment we are trying to support this Planet 10, this association, which is supporting African Austrian women in Vienna, which really have the hardest time to find housing. And we have a piece of land, which we have like the structure, we could be a Mietshäuser-Syndikat, what we need is money. So the question is like to really investment money, and of course within these projects, you don't have like the big scale developers or money that is coming in, but we have to find ways, and actually there is ways. I had a beautiful project which was financed by what we called Nazi money, where basically people inherited some money and said, like, I'm not touching that because that's money that I do not want to actually use, but only for a good project. So I think there's a lot of possibilities to do that, which I am happy to also now teach, not only practice, because my chair is actually project development and also building economy and project development. And I've realized that what I'm really interested in terms of right to the city is how to support people to become what, if we hear the word project developer, we actually think of one type of person or figure. And actually what I believe is that everybody could be a project developer in terms of like that you don't need to have money, but you need to have an idea of how you reshape, reorganize, maybe decommodify and work on the city landscape. So to actually support that, not only as a practitioner, but also in teaching is great. And then what I really learned from Jeremy Till, who is like this powerful architect who really says that the climate catastrophe is at this moment architecture, that we need to rethink literally every term and every practice that we do. And that also makes me rethink, what does a project mean? First of all, to say with building economy, what does building mean? And we have students that ask and demand for a full stop on building, a full stop on kind of building any new structure until everything is used that is there. There's a full kind of, then there's an idea of rethinking economy in terms of looking at economies, of like all the different solidarity, feminist economies that are never kind of foregrounded. And when we think of economy, we have to rethink what a project means, and we have to rethink most of all what development means. Development, growth, and so on. And I think that's really I think it's a super enormous task. I think we need a lot of maybe also such collective thinking together to get steps further here. So thank you, Raquel, for steering that discussion, and also you, Elke, and AZW to making that happen.
So that was the last word?
Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to make this the last word, but I can see that people...
So I think I would like to maybe not add last words, because what we actually need is words that help us think and act further. So not last words, but openings to new beginnings that overcome maybe the despair that was very much present, I think, during the last 20 to 30 years, when the profession was being so much implicated in building capital and in subjugating the energies and the potentials and the creativity of so many architects to what the world looks like now. And now we are finding ourselves at this moment where, listening to the two of you, there is very much hope that you, with many other people, are building a different world after the modernist acceleration of what is being called the Capitalocene, Plantationocene, and so on and so forth. So I want to say something about the Architecture Center, because I'm a guest here, but like you are also guests here, and I think it's wonderful that such a center exists, where architecture is actually being thought of in different ways. Angelika Fitz, with her team, did an exhibition on Land for All, so how we relate differently to this relation that is underneath our feet, and where we need to learn that wir können es nicht mit den Füßen treten, so in this very literal sense that we need to re-earth, as Raquel was saying today. And maybe I will also add a book, so we all had our book moment. So also Angelika, Marvi, and myself, we did a book, and Raquel contributed an interview to it, where some of the thoughts that were being expanded tonight on the relation between architecture, urbanism, policies, but also notions around care, ecologies, and in a way why we could say that housing is also a feminist issue, can be read and then practiced further and shared with others. So I want to thank you, the audience, for your patience with us and for navigating around the shared microphone tonight. Thank you.